Greetings and welcome to 3dmotive.com. My name is Alan Thorne and I'll be your instructor on this comprehensive course introducing you to the Unity 5 game engine and its exciting feature set. If you're a newcomer to Unity or game development generally, and if you want to make incredible games, then you've certainly come to the right place, because in this course I'll show you just how easy Unity makes game development for everybody. Now, this is a comprehensive course, which means I'll cover everything you need to know for using Unity confidently, starting from the very basics and ending at an intermediate level. So in this first module of the course, we'll look at the core and fundamental features of Unity, the things everybody needs to know from the start. We'll see how to use the Unity interface, get comfortable with its controls, import and configure assets like meshes and textures, and also build basic levels complete with player controls. By the end of this part, you'll not only be very familiar with the Unity essentials, but will have a solid foundation for moving forwards with confidence. I think you're really going to love the toolset on offer, so let's jump in and get started. So welcome to the world of Unity. Now, just to briefly explain what Unity is before going any further, it is simply this. Unity is a game engine. That means it's a program that you can use to make video games. And it really is that simple. If you want to make video games, you can use Unity to do it. So first of all, let's see how we can get our hands on Unity, how you can download the software and start using it. Now, I've opened up a web browser window here and I've navigated to the link unity3d.com. You can see that here in the address bar. And I'm looking at the Unity website, and straight away it says Unity 5 is here, and indeed it is here. So we can click on this yellow button here that says Get Unity 5, and we can click on that to download the software. So I'm going to just click on Get Unity 5. Now, Unity 5 is available for both Windows and Mac, meaning that if you have a Windows PC or if you have a Mac computer, you can download and use Unity. Now, of course, you may be aware that Unity can distribute the games to many different platforms. In other words, you can make games for many different platforms, including Windows, Mac, but also iOS, Android, Linux, and even console devices. But to use the development tools themselves, the software to make the games, you need either a Windows PC or a Mac. So when I click on the download button, I'm taken to this web page here, which lists two editions of Unity, and these are the Personal Edition and the Professional Edition. Now, you may be wondering what the difference is between these two. The Professional Edition is an edition that you have to pay for, and the Personal Edition is completely free. Free means here that you can download the software, start using it right away, make games with it, and even make commercial games, games that you can sell, and you don't have to pay anything to do that. Now, I just want to point your attention here to the very first line in the comparison chart, which says Engine with all features, and notice that a tick is included in both the Personal Edition and the Professional Edition. Now, that means in both the Personal Edition and the Professional Edition, you have access to the total range of features in the Unity software. You are not limited in any particular edition to only a limited set of features. You have complete access to them all. And notice here in the second line as well that you have royalty-free access to them, meaning that you can sell your games using the Unity engine and you don't have to pay anything to do that. Now, there are some limitations that do apply between the personal and professional editions, and I just want to briefly show you where they are on the website so that you can read more about them if you want to. But in short, you can download the Unity software today for free and start using it right away, and that software is the full featured version. So now I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom of this page, down to the very bottom. By the way, you can also click on the More Features button here to expand the feature set and see the difference between the two. But I'm just going to scroll right down here, down to the bottom to where it says FAQ for Frequently Asked Questions. I'm going to click on that link here to Frequently Asked Questions, and straight away you'll notice we get a range of questions that may be asked. For example, can I make commercial games content with the Unity Personal Edition? I'm going to click the plus icon to expand that, and it says yes, But notice there is a condition that you did not earn or receive more than $100,000 in the last financial year. So you may have to read up on some of the information as to whether you can use the personal or the professional edition. But in short, you can generally download the free edition and start using it. So go ahead and download the latest version of Unity, and I will meet you inside the Unity interface. Now, the very first time you start Unity 5, you will be presented with the project creation screen. It may appear in this Get Started mode with a video down here that you can watch, which introduces the Unity engine, and it also gives you access to the community forums, the Unity documentation, and some getting started tutorials which you may wish to look at. But actually, generally to get started, we're going to switch over here to the Projects tab. So I'm going to select Projects, and we have this tab here. Now, if you've started Unity before and you've saved projects, you may have a list of recently opened projects down here which you can choose from, but the first time you use Unity, you won't have anything here, just as it appears here. Now, in Unity, one project equals one game. So when you create a game, you are creating a project. And a project simply represents a folder on your hard drive that's a collection of files, and these all together make up your game. So to create a new project, I move up here to the New Project button. I'm going to select New Project, and when I do that, it asks me to give the project a name and to specify a folder on the hard drive where I'm going to save the project. And also we have these buttons down here where it asks me, am I making a 3D game or a 2D game? Now, don't worry about which option you choose, as all of these are entirely changeable after the fact, but I'm just going to select 3D. There's also a button here for asset packages, which allow you to include a range of pre-made files that Unity have made for you to make development easier. You can incorporate those into your project. For example, if I click on asset packages, I get this list of objects here, and I can place a tick in these different boxes to import all kinds of pre-made assets into the project. Your list may appear different from mine, but again, I'm going to leave all of these completely blank because once again, these are things that we can add and remove after the fact. So I'm just going to choose Done and leave that blank. I'm going to give the project a name. I'm going to call this, for example, 3D Motive Start Project. And then all I have to do is choose the button Create Project, and that will create a completely new empty Unity project, and we can get started from there. So I'm going to choose Create Project. And it may ask you a question about, do you want to save any particular files if you have a project open previously, but I'm just going to leave all of that and say don't save. So I'm going to choose that. And straight away, bang, here we're presented with the Unity editor in its default configuration. So next up, we're going to take a look at how this interface works and basically the layout settings that we have. So let's take a brief look at the Unity interface and its general arrangement. When you first start Unity and you've created an empty new project, you will have this user interface arrangement here, which is known as the default layout. So at the very top, we have, as is common among these applications, we have the file or the application menu, which provides us with access to high-level application features. I'm not going to be going through every single item telling you what they do here. We're going to be using this menu as we go through the course. And then beneath this, we have the application toolbar, which gives us access to some of the most common features in the application. And in fact, notice right here at the center, we have this play button. Now, by pressing this, we will actually play our game. So, well, let's take it for a test run now. I'm just going to click the play button. And when I do that, notice that the display down here changes. In fact, what Unity has done, it has switched from this Scene tab to this Game tab. And in fact, when I press play again to stop playing back our game, and by the way, notice we have a completely empty game. We just have this skyline and the ground beneath. I'm going to stop playback by pressing play again, and this will then switch back from the Game tab to the Scene tab. So this Scene tab here is where we make the game, and the Game tab ultimately is where we play test the game. And we can switch between the two just by clicking on them here. So in the Scene tab, which occupies the largest part of the interface, we get a visual representation, a director's eye view of the game world being created, and it's completely empty, except for these two items here. We have a light and we have a camera. And in fact, notice over here on the hierarchy panel, we have a list of two objects. We have a camera and a light. So this hierarchy panel is a list of all the objects in the game world that we see here. And in fact, I can select these objects just by clicking on them. For example, I can click on this camera here, and when I select the camera, this panel over here, which is called the Object Inspector, this changes to show me more information about the item that is currently selected. So this inspector panel is context sensitive. I can select this light, and again I get details about the light inside this Object Inspector. And then finally down here we have this project panel here, which contains nothing. It says this folder is empty, and that's because we've got a completely new project here. But this project panel, this lists all the files that are part of our project folder. All the files that are making up our game will be listed in the project panel, and right now, because our game is completely new and empty, we have an empty project panel. So that really represents the basic panels of the interface, but all of these panels are entirely customizable. For example, this scene panel here, if I want to increase its size, I can just move my mouse to the edges and just expand and contract that to make it larger or smaller. So I can just pull this up to make this larger and make it larger this way, and I can completely resize them. I can also drag and drop the panels into completely different areas. So I can drag and drop the inspector panel over to this side, and we get this arrangement here. But I don't like that. I'm going to click and drag the inspector back over to this side here. And then we have this project panel down here. I can drag and drop that anywhere else. So I can drag and drop it in here, for example. But I'm going to put this back to the beginning. Now, if you arrive at an arrangement that you don't like, you can actually readjust the interface according to a set of presets. Now, the presets are simply pre-made user interface arrangements that you can jump between to quickly arrive at different layouts that you may like. So let me just restore Unity back to the default layout. Over here in the top right hand side we have this layout here which says default. I'm going to click on that drop down box here, and from the list I'm going to choose default that you can see here. And when I select the default option, the interface is reset back to its default layout. If I don't like the default layout though, I can easily change it to something else. I can click on default in this drop down box again, and for example select the tool layout. And when I do that, I get this arrangement of the panels. And again I can choose, for example, the four-way split and get this arrangement of panels. And in fact I can even create my own custom arrangements. For example, if I wanted to put it back to the default layout and I wanted the inspector over here and I wanted the project panel over here, for example, like this, I could save this layout simply by going over here to this drop down list and choosing save layout, and I can give this a name such as custom layout, and I can then choose the button save like so. And now I can switch back, for example, to the default layout. Here's the default layout. Can select the drop down and choose custom, and I get my custom layout. So you can create your own completely customized layouts, and in fact you can delete them too. Here is the custom layout. I'm going to choose delete layout, and I'm going to delete the custom layout and remove that completely from the list. So I'm going to restore my interface back to the default settings, and this is the layout that I'm going to be using for the rest of this course. But if you prefer a different layout, then please feel free to use that. So let's move on. So now we've seen the fundamentals of the Unity user interface, and what I want to do now is to show you the asset store before we consider anything else in Unity. Now the asset store is an online shop and database that have a range of assets that you can purchase for your games, but also free assets that you can simply include in your games and use them straight away. And it also includes completed Unity projects, complete games that you can open up in Unity and examine. And I want to download a complete game because that's going to make it a really fun way to get content into Unity and to learn the user interface while we examine a completed project. Now the completed project that I'm going to download and use is completely free and available to you from the Unity Asset Store, so you can follow along with me. Now to access the Assets Store, I'm going to move up here to the File menu and choose Window and then click Assets Store, or I can press Ctrl 9 on my keyboard, which is also Command 9 on a Mac computer. So I'm going to choose Assets Store here, which will load the Assets Store window. Now to access and download data from the Assets Store, you will need an Assets Store account, but you can sign up for one of those absolutely free of charge. So what I'm going to do once you get access to the Assets Store, you can browse all the different assets available to you. Notice some assets are free and some you do have to pay for. So I'm going to scroll back up here, and in this search box I'm going to search for the term Viking Village, like so, and press return on the keyboard. I'm searching for this Viking Village project here, which is provided by Unity Technologies and it's available for free. So I'm going to click Viking Village. And you can see here we have this Viking Village window, which allows us to import the Viking Village into our Unity project. You can see screenshots down here of the project available, and here is another screenshot of the project that we can access. So we can actually download all of this content and put it into Unity and really just explore this Viking Village and learn the interface as we go. So right now over here in the interface, you will see that there will be a button which, if this is the first time you've seen this, will say Download. So go ahead and click that download button to download the content to your computer. And once it's downloaded, that button will change to import, which I have here. So I'm going to click this import button here, and Unity will display this decompressing dialog. And once that has completed decompressing, it will show me an import dialog. So once the software has downloaded, you would see this import dialog here that I have visible, and I can simply just choose to import the entire Viking Village into my project. To do that, I'm going to leave all of these settings at their default, so all of these boxes on the left hand side should be enabled to import all of these files into the project. If they are not enabled, you can simply click the All button to select all the assets. And then I'm going to choose the Import button here to import the Viking Village into my Unity project. So I'm going to click Import. That will import the Viking Village. And that may take a while. Unity has quite a lot of data to process and go through during the import process. So I'm going to pick up recording in the next video after all of this data has been imported, and then we'll jump into this Viking project and learn the Unity controls. So now it's time for us to have a look at the basic viewport controls in Unity. And here I have a Unity project open, and I've just imported the Viking Village asset from the Unity Assets Store. And if you take a look down here in the project panel, you can see that all these different folders and files have been added to the project. And these represent all of the data that has been imported from the Viking Village into my Unity project. And actually, remember I said these correspond to a folder on my hard drive, and I can actually locate all of these files simply by right-clicking in the empty space here in the project panel. And from the menu, I can choose Show in Explorer. And when I do that, I get this dialog appear which shows me in Windows Explorer all of the files or folders inside my Unity project. And if I double click on the Assets folder here, I can see that all of these files and folders match up to the files and folders that you see down here in the Unity project panel. So this represents the files on my hard drive. I'm just going to close the Assets folder. And you'll notice here in this scene that although we've imported the Viking Village, I don't see anything in this scene at all. It's still a completely empty scene, just as it was before. And that's simply because I'm not looking at the Viking Village right now. This scene here represents a level. In Unity, the word scene means a level or an environment. And right now, all I have open is a completely empty environment. To have a look at the Viking Village scene, I have to move down here to my project panel. And there is a folder here called Scenes. I'm going to double click on the Scenes folder to open that inside the project panel, and you'll see here that there's the Viking Village asset. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to double click on that scene here. In fact, if I just select it once, you will see down here it says the Viking Village.unity, and that's because it's a Unity asset. In fact, this is a scene. The scenes are shown with this Unity icon here. So I can double click this Viking Village asset here to open the Viking village scene into this level editor here. And when I do that, the contents change here inside the scene tab, and also in the hierarchy panel, the list of objects change here. So that what I'm seeing here now is in fact the floor or the mud of the Viking village. So this is the place to begin. I've just opened up this Viking village scene, and now we're ready to start looking around this environment and exploring the environment using the viewport navigation controls. Now, the viewport navigation controls are simply the mouse and keyboard controls that we can use to move around and explore the environment inside the scene view here. If you are familiar with the software Maya, or if you are familiar with Blender using the Maya style controls, then you will already know how to navigate the viewport because Unity uses the Maya style controls. And let's see how they work. For example, I can hold down the middle mouse button on my mouse. And as I do that with my mouse held over this scene viewport here, I can use my middle mouse button and click and drag around the viewport to kind of pan around. So I can start panning the environment here. I can also use the mouse scroll wheel to zoom in and zoom out. So I can kind of zoom right out here and see the Viking village from quite far away. It looks quite pretty at this distance. And then I can use the mouse scroll wheel to zoom in again. So again, the scroll wheel to zoom in and zoom out. And I can also hold down the middle mouse button and pan left and pan right. Now we can also select objects simply by clicking them. So I can click on, for example, this house over here. And if I want to focus on this object, to zoom my viewport, to center my view on that object, I can press the F key on the keyboard for frame. So I'm going to press F. And when I do that, the view zooms straight to that house here. I can also do the same thing by double clicking the object over here in the hierarchy panel. So when I select the object here, it is selected for me in the hierarchy panel, and I can just double click on the object and that will focus on it. So if I pan my mouse over here and I double click the object in the hierarchy panel, it does the same thing as pressing the F key on the keyboard. So again, I can now use my middle mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out, focusing on that object. Now if I want to rotate around the object, what I can do is I can hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, and with the Alt key held down, I can left click and drag my mouse, and then I can rotate around the object that I am focused on. So I'm holding down the Alt key, left clicking and dragging my mouse, and now I'm rotating around that object. If I click on, for example, this object over here and press the F key, and then I hold down the Alt and click and drag, I'm now rotating around this object here. So I can zoom out, move around, Alt click and drag, and I can kind of just zoom around the center of my viewport. So Alt left click dragging around will rotate the view, middle mouse can pan around, scroll wheel, zoom in and zoom out. And using that combination of controls, we are entirely able to navigate around in the viewport. So I'm changing my angle here by holding down Alt, left clicking and dragging to get the view of the scene that I want. I'm going to zoom in a bit more using the middle mouse wheel like so. We can also use a first-person control scheme, and to do that, all I have to do is hold down the right button on my mouse, so the right mouse button, and in fact, with that right mouse button held down, by moving my mouse, I can kind of now use a first-person look-around mode, and I can also use the W, A, S, and D keys on the keyboard to use first-person navigation controls to kind of move around the environment here in a first-person mode if I prefer that control scheme instead. So I can use the first-person controls by holding down the right mouse button, moving the mouse around and using W, A, S, and D to move around on the keyboard. But I generally prefer the Maya style controls most of the time. That's what I use. So these are really great controls, and it's really important when working in Unity to really make these controls second nature to you. So those are the viewport controls that will allow you to navigate absolutely anywhere within the scene. In this movie, I want to demonstrate the full screen ability that you can find on each of the panels in the interface. What I have opened here in front of me in the Unity editor is the Viking scene that we have seen previously. And what I want to do is, in fact, give this a test run. I actually want to play this Viking scene and explore it in first-person mode. And thankfully for me, this scene is already set up. The Viking scene is already configured to use first-person controls. So to give those a test run, all we need to do is to press the play button on the toolbar here. So I'm going to press the play button here, and Unity will immediately switch to the Game tab. And now straight away I'm using my mouse to control the view of the character, and I can use the W, A, S and D keys on the keyboard to explore the Viking village in glorious first-person mode using all the latest and fancy features of Unity 5. Now, of course, right now this is in a windowed mode. I'm looking at this game really just in the Game tab, and it's kind of small. What I want to do is I want to play this in full screen. So I'm going to stop playback. You can do that in two ways. You can press the escape key on the keyboard to kind of release your mouse cursor and then click on the play button to stop playback. Or you can press Control P on the keyboard, that's Command P on a Mac, to stop playback. So Control P or Command P will effectively be the equivalent of pressing the play button on the toolbar to start and stop playback. So how can I make these views full screen? Well, it's quite easy. All you have to do in Unity is simply hover your mouse cursor over any panel that you want to make full screen. So right now, let's say the Scene tab here. I'm going to hover my mouse cursor over the Scene tab. And on the keyboard, I'm going to press the Shift spacebar key together. So Shift spacebar, and that will maximize the scene view so I can now see that in full screen. And again, I can use Shift spacebar again to restore the view back to its original size. And I can do this with absolutely any panel that I want. For example, the hierarchy panel over here, all I have to do is hover my mouse over the hierarchy panel and press Shift space, and that will immediately make the hierarchy panel full screen. I'm going to press Shift space again to restore that, and I can do the same with the project panel. Hover my cursor over here and press Shift space, and again we get that full screen. So let's play the game in full screen mode. And to do that, I'm going to switch over here to the Game tab, and hovering my mouse over the Game tab, I'm going to press Shift spacebar to make this full screen, and then I'm going to press play on the toolbar. And now when I play the game, actually I just paused it by accident there, but now when I play the game, I'm now playing this in full screen mode as opposed to the windowed mode. So I can see this in a much more larger screen, much clearer, and it's looking much, much better. Let's just stop playback again by pressing Control P on the keyboard. And I'm going to restore my view by pressing Shift space again. Notice also here on the Game tab, there is a button on the toolbar that says Maximize on Play. When I click on this and I enable it, every time then when I press the play button on the toolbar, Unity will automatically maximize the play mode view so that I can play my game in full screen. So I'm going to press Control P to stop playback again, and I'm just going to toggle this Maximize on Play off because I don't want it to do that automatically. But if you do prefer that, then be sure to toggle that option on. So that's the basics of how you can make the panels full screen and in windowed mode. Next, I want to consider the general transformation controls for moving objects around in the scene. Now I want to consider the viewport transformation controls, which are very important. Previously, we've seen how we can move around the viewport, move the camera around, that is, using the Maya style controls. But what I want to do here is to examine how we can select objects in the scene and move those around. Now what I'm looking at in the viewport in front of me is the Done Stealth Unity scene here, which is called Done Stealth. This is part of the Unity sample projects called the Stealth Project, and like the Viking Village, this is freely accessible from the Asset Store. So if you want to open up and examine this project, all you have to do is choose Window Asset Store, and inside the Asset Store, all you have to search for here in the search box is Stealth. So I'm going to choose Stealth, like so, and straight away here in the viewport you can see here Stealth provided by Unity Technologies. It's a free project and you can download and import that into your Unity scene and examine the scene for this. Or you could still use the Viking village. It really doesn't matter. You can use any scene to explore the transformation controls. So I'm going to close the asset store here and return back to the scene. If you do go ahead and load this scene, the first time you load it, it may in fact look like this, a completely blue box, because the fogging information is turned on. As I slowly go into the scene, you can see that a blue mist or fog begins to disappear. If you want to turn that off in the scene viewport, you can do that by clicking on this drop down box here and clicking on fog to disable that. And also on my screen, it's looking kind of dark. If I wanted to brighten up this scene and view it without the lighting information, I can do that simply by clicking on the lighting icon here on the scene toolbar. So I'm going to click the lighting icon here, and now the lighting for the scene has been deactivated. It doesn't look as good, but it allows me to see objects more clearly. But for the moment, I'm going to reactivate lighting just to turn that back on. So we have this scene here in front of me, and I can navigate it just as I could with the Viking scene using the Maya style controls. So to select objects in the scene, all we have to do really is to click on them. But we have to be careful which mode we are in. If we look at the toolbar up here, we can see that there are a range of icons determining which mode we are in. Right now I've got this hand icon here. Now when this is active, I cannot select anything in the viewport at all. It prevents me from accidentally selecting and moving things around. All this hand icon allows me to do is pan around. So I can just click and drag in the viewport to pan around. So this tool, this hand tool, can be accessed by pressing the Q key on the keyboard. So you just have to press Q and that tool will become active. The tool next to it is called the Translate tool. And I can click on that here, and notice when I do, my mouse cursor begins to change. I can still use the Maya style controls to navigate around in the viewport, but this time with the Translate tool active, I can then click on objects in the scene and select them. I know they are selected because they become highlighted like this object here, and I get this transformation gizmo centered on the object here. Now I can access the Translate tool by pressing the W key on the keyboard. So I press Q for the pan tool and you'll see that this becomes active, and then I can press W for the Translate tool and then this becomes active. The Translate tool allows me not only to select objects in the scene, but I can also move them around. And I can use these green arrows here, or the green arrow pointing up, and the red arrow pointing this way, and the blue arrow pointing forwards. This is known as the Translate gizmo, and I can use it to move objects around. So for example, if I wanted to move this object forward, all I have to do is click and drag on the blue arrow here, and I can pull the object forward, like so. I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. And actually I'm going to maximize my viewport here by pressing Shift Spacebar on the keyboard, and you can still see these tools are active even in the maximize view. So I can click and hold the blue arrow here to move the object forwards and backwards. I can click on the red axis to move it sideways, and I can click on the green axis to move it up and down. I can also click in the center on these planes here to move it in 2 dimensions at once, but generally I prefer to move in just 1 dimension by clicking on these axes just one at a time. So I can move this object around, and you can press Ctrl Z on the keyboard several times to perform multiple undos. So the next tool to consider now is the one next to it, which is the Rotation tool. Now the Rotate tool allows us to turn objects around, perhaps unsurprisingly, and we can access that simply by clicking the Rotate icon here, or we can press the E key on the keyboard. You may be starting to see a pattern here. For the Pan tool it's Q, for the Translate tool it's W, and for the Rotate tool it's E. So I can press the E key on the keyboard, and when I do that I get access to the rotation gizmo that I can see here, and I can simply click and drag on the different axes to rotate the object around. So right now, before I go ahead and rotate anything further, you can see that these icons, this icon for a light here and this icon for a light here, these are really quite large, and I don't really want them so large. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this icon here that says Gizmos. I'm going to click on that to get a drop-down box, and for the 3D gizmos, I'm just going to reduce their size to something very, very small here like this, so that I can see my selection a lot better here in the viewport. So again, here we've got the rotation gizmo here, which gives us a blue and red and green axis. So I'm going to click and drag on this axis here, and you can rotate the object forwards around its center like so. And I can do the same here for rotating on the blue axis, which is this way. And again, I can do the same for the green axis to rotate it around in this direction here. So that's really how the rotate tool works, and I can rotate pretty much any other object that I want to select. So I can, for example, move over here in the viewport. I can pick this object, for example, and I can pick all kinds of other objects in the scene. So I'm going to just select this object here again and press F on the keyboard to frame this object. And again, I'm going to switch to the next tool, which is the scale tool. That's this tool here. To access this tool, I can press the R key on the keyboard. So again, it's Q, W, E, and R. The scale tool allows me to change the size of objects. So if I want to change the size of the whole object in every dimension by the same amount, I can click on this white box at the center of the gizmo, click and drag, left click and drag that is, and I can really just increase the proportions of the object. So by left clicking and dragging to the right, I increase the scale, and by left clicking and dragging to the left, I reduce the scale of the object, and I can even make it very small. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that, but I can also scale in a particular axis. So let's just bring this into the center of the room so we can see it better. I'm just going to press W on the keyboard to switch to the translate tool and just bring this to the center of the room here. I'm then going to switch again to the scale tool by pressing the R key on the keyboard, and this time I'm going to drag, left click and drag on these particular ends here. So I'm going to left click and drag on the blue one and click and drag, and notice now we're scaling just in that dimension only. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. Let's try scaling in the red dimension, this dimension here, X. So again, we're getting that kind of look. I press Ctrl Z, undo that, and this time try scaling in the green, like so, and it will scale all the way up there. I can even scale it down disproportionately. So by clicking and dragging on the white box, we scale proportionally. That is called uniform scale. And then the other axis allows us to scale the object non-uniformly, that is disproportionately in one axis only. So in seeing these tools, W, that is Q, W, E, and R, which stands for the selection or pan tool, the translate tool, the rotate tool, and the scale tool, we have seen all the fundamental transformation tools. There is one tool remaining, which is this tool here, the Rect Transform tool. This tool we will see in a later section of the course. Primarily, these tools here relate to 3D objects, and they're moving about and transforming within the scene. So that represents the extent of the transformation tools, and using them we can pick any object in the scene, and we will then have the ability to change its position, location, rotation, and scale. Now I want to demonstrate the Object Inspector and basic object creation in Unity. I have open in front of me here a completely blank and empty new scene, and you can create a new scene at any time in Unity simply by coming up here to the File menu and choosing File and New Scene, or press Ctrl N on the keyboard. And then once you have done that, a completely blank and new scene is created. But if you look down here inside the project panel, you will notice that there's no scene created at all. The scene that we have just made is not added as an asset of the project. To do that, we have to save the scene, and we have to do that manually. We can press Ctrl S on the keyboard on Windows or Command S on a Mac. Or I can move up here to the File menu and choose File and Save Scene. When I do that, a Save dialog appears, and I'm just going to call this scene Basic Scene, and then press Save here on the box. So here I have now saved the scene, and you can see it's been added as Basic Scene inside the project panel, and now this is now part of an asset of the project. So in this basic scene, what I'm going to do is create some basic objects and examine their properties in the Object Inspector and see generally how the Object Inspector, which is over here, to see how this works. So I'm going to create some basic objects, and Unity provides some options to do that. I'm going to come up here to the File menu and choose Game Object, 3D Object, and here we have a range of primitives that we can choose from. I'm going to add a floor to the scene, and to do that we can use a plane object. So I'm going to click on Plane, and here we have a plane generated in the scene, and you can see in the hierarchy panel we have a plane object. I'm just going to pull that down a little further into the scene, and straight away you can see drawn here in the background is a grid in the scene. Now I don't want this grid displayed, I want to temporarily deactivate the grid. So to do that I'm going to move up here to where it says Gizmos, click on this drop down, and where it says Show Grid, I'm going to deactivate that checkbox. When I deactivate it, the grid now disappears from the scene. Now on top of this floor I want to add a cube object, so I'm going to choose Game Object, 3D Object, and choose Cube. And now a cube is added to the scene. In fact, I'm going to maximize my viewport here by pressing Shift Space on the keyboard, and I'm going to move the cube down so that it rests on the floor. You can see the cube here, and also notice that the light in the scene is automatically casting a shadow for the cube here. So I'm just going to move the cube slightly out of the way. I'm also going to create a sphere object, so create Game Object, 3D Object, and I'm going to choose Sphere. And I'm just going to pull that up so it sits on the floor again, and move this object over here and push that into the distance here. And finally I'm going to choose Game Object, 3D Object again, and I'm going to choose Cylinder. I'm going to add a cylinder. So now we have three separate objects. We have a cube, a cylinder, and a sphere in the scene, all three of them resting on a plane. So I'm going to press Shift Space to come out of this view, and I'm going to explore how the Object Inspector relates to these objects that we've created. So when nothing is selected, the Object Inspector appears completely blank and empty, and that's because the Object Inspector is a context-sensitive panel. All I have to do is select an object in the scene, such as this cylinder, and I could also select this by clicking on the cylinder here in the hierarchy panel. And when I do that, the properties for the cylinder are displayed. Now Unity uses a component-based system, which means that every single object in the scene, the cylinder, the cube, the sphere, and the plane, they are all made up from components. On selecting the cylinder, you can see here in the inspector that we have the name listed. So right now we have cylinder. I could of course clicking here and change this to, for example, enemy. If this was an enemy character, it also changes here in the hierarchy panel, and in fact I can double click or single click and then click again here on the object in the hierarchy panel and also change the name from here. It is very important when you are making your own games that contains potentially many objects to give all of your objects sensible names, so that things aren't simply just called cube 1, cube 2, cube 3. The idea is to be able to look at this hierarchy panel and identify what each of the objects are simply by name. So on selecting this cylinder object here, I can look at the Object Inspector, and you'll see that we have a range of components. These components are grouped in these different panels here. For example, I can click on this twirly arrow to expand and contract this component, and I can do the same for the others. So you can see that ultimately we have a total of 4 components that are applied to this cylinder. They are the transform component, the cylinder component, the capsule collider component, and the mesh renderer component. And these other objects will all have their own combinations of components. Now all objects, every single object in the scene will have a transform component. I'm just going to select the cylinder again, and let's expand the transform component. In here you can see we have position, rotation, and scale properties for the object, and these are exactly the same values that we are adjusting when we use the transformation tools. So if I select the translate tool with W and I start moving this cylinder around, if you look at the Object Inspector over here, I'm moving the object on the x-axis, and those values are changing to reflect that, and the same for the other axis. Now we can also set the values manually from the inspector. So if I wanted to position this cylinder at the world origin, I could come into X and choose 0, press Tab to move to the Y box and choose 0, Tab again to move to the Z box and choose 0, and now that object is positioned at the world origin exactly. but I'm just going to position it back here on the plane. Notice also that you don't have to just type in the values. You can also click and drag on the X and Y settings here. So to move in X, I can click and drag on the X value. I can also click and drag on the Y value, and I can also click and drag on the Z value here. So I can adjust those sliders to change the settings for the objects. And so finally, we can also adjust the other components. For example, down here on the Capsule Collider component and the Mesh Renderer component, if I just expand the Mesh Renderer component, you can see it has many different properties here, and some of these we're going to be considering later in the course. But right now there's a tick box next to the Mesh Renderer component indicating to Unity whether the Mesh Renderer is turned on. The Mesh Renderer component is responsible for showing the mesh in the scene. So if I take the tick out of that box, suddenly the cylinder disappears. The object is still there. Notice that the gizmo here, the transformation gizmo, is still centered on that cylinder. It's still listed here in the hierarchy panel, only we can't see it, and that's simply because I've deactivated the Mesh Renderer component. I'm going to reactivate that so we can see the cylinder again. Notice we can do the same thing for the sphere. Again, this has a Mesh Renderer component. I can deactivate that to hide the sphere, and the same for the cube. I can deactivate that as well. So all of these objects ultimately are constituted by the collection of components that they have attached to them. If you have two objects and they have exactly the same combination of components with exactly the same values, when you take this transform component, you add this cube component, add the box collider, and add the Mesh Renderer component, you get the same object. That means that different objects will have different collections of components and settings. So that's the basics of using the Object Inspector to examine the properties of objects. Let's move on. Now for the rest of this module, we're going to be creating a basic game together in Unity. That is, we're going to start from a completely empty project and make a basic game in which we can roll a ball around a simple maze, and we'll be able to control the ball, we'll be able to have the camera move to follow the ball, and the ball will be able to bump into all kinds of things. So we'll create something simple like that. But it's going to involve quite a lot of things, and we'll see all those things come together in Unity based on the concepts that we've seen already. So at the very beginning here, I'm going to create a completely new project to begin our sample. So I'm going to go up here to the New Project button and click on that. And I'm going to give the project a name of Sample Rolling Ball, like so. And down here in the Assets Package group, I'm going to click on that. Now at this stage, we could import some packages that we are going to be using for this project. In particular, I'm going to be importing the Characters package, and I'm also going to scroll down and import the Prototyping package. Now you could enable these packages here and then choose Done, but I'm going to deliberately leave them unchecked so that I can show you how you can import them even if you begin with a completely blank project. So I'm going to accept all of these settings and choose Create Project. And when I do that, we suddenly get this dialog. No, I don't want to save any settings, so I go Don't Save. We begin with this completely new and empty project, which is called Sample Rolling Ball. And here it is completely blank. Now let me show you before we go any further how you can import the asset packages that I mentioned previously. They contain a variety of pre-made objects that Unity has made for us that we can add to our game, and it's going to save us a lot of work. So let's import them by coming up here to the menu where it says Assets. I'm going to select Assets and then choose Import Package. And I'm going to import the Characters package. So I'm going to click on Characters. This will then display an Import Package dialog. Everything should be enabled, but if it's not, be sure to press the All button to select everything and then choose Import. So I'm going to select that. That will import all of the data in that package. When these are added to the project, a new folder will be created here in the project panel, and that folder will be called Standard Assets. And here we have the Standard Assets folder that contains all of the data that we imported. There is also another folder here called Editor, which will add extra features to the Unity editor, but we don't need to worry about that right now. I'm going to go back to the Assets menu and this time choose Import Package, and I'm going to select Prototyping. This comes with a range of mesh assets and other objects that we can use to quickly build a level. So I'm going to select the Prototyping package, and once again we get the import back, and I'm just going to choose Import to import everything there, and then we will import all of those assets, and they appear again inside the Standard Assets folder. If I double click on that folder, you can see we have our prototyping package along with characters and some other folders that have been generated too. So that's a good beginning for our project. It's still completely empty, but we've imported all the assets that we need to get started. So now we have an empty project with a completely new scene, and the first thing I want to do is to save the scene to make it an asset of the project. So I'm going to press Ctrl S on the keyboard to bring up the save dialog, and I'm going to give this name of Maze. So file name Maze, and I'm going to choose save, and I'm going to save everything here. So now we have a maze scene that's added as the project here, and every time I then choose Ctrl S to save the scene, it will be saved to this maze asset. Now the first thing we want to do for our rollerball game is to create a floor that the ball is going to rest on. So to do that, I'm going to move up here to the menu and choose Game Object, Create 3D Object, and I'm going to choose Quad. Not Plane, but I'm going to choose Quad. So I've selected Quad, and we get this object created in the scene. Now right now you can't really see it. I'm going to rotate my view and move it further around, and there you can see we have this quad, and this quad, notice, is completely one-sided. If we go around the other side, it's completely invisible. So we want this underside of the quad here to be facing upwards for the floor. Now of course I could rotate this by switching to the E tool, the rotate tool, and rotate it around, and if you have a look in the object inspector and I put it there for example, it looks roughly right. But again, it's snapped here, and it is in fact exactly right. You can see here on the rotation 90, but of course I might not always be so precise. I might be slightly off like that, and notice now I've rotated 81 degrees. So I'm going to Ctrl Z to undo that. You can be exactly right by using snapping. So I can hold down the Control key on the keyboard, and while I rotate this, you'll notice here in the Object Inspector that I will rotate to specified increments. So 30 degrees, and I'm going to rotate it around to 90 degrees. I could of course just come into here and type 90 degrees to make it exact, and now that quad is resting exactly here for the floor. Now I want it to be a bit larger than this, so I'm going to select the floor here in the scene, and under here, under the scale setting, I'm going to set the scale to 4. I could of course use the scale tool to do that, or press the R key on the keyboard, but I'm going to type in the scale here through the Object Inspector. So I'm going to set the scale to 4, 4 and 4 to make it 4 times as large in all dimensions. And the name for this object, I'm going to change it from quad to floor, like so. And now we've created a basic floor object. Now of course I want to give this floor some appearance. Right now it is completely white, and I want to change the way that this floor looks, and to do that we can use materials. Now the subject of materials is considered later in this course, so I'm going to use them just very briefly here and show you how you can work with materials to assign an appearance to your objects. Here in the Standard Assets folder, under the Prototyping group, we have a folder called Materials. So you can get to there from Standard Assets, Prototyping, and here you have a folder called Materials. I'm going to open that folder here, and we have a range of different materials that we can use and assign to our objects. For example, I could select this navy grid here, and by selecting that I can see the properties for the material displayed here in the Object Inspector, and in fact I can expand this preview view here to see more clearly the object looking with the material on it. So I'm just going to close that down just a little bit, and all I have to do to assign this material to this floor object is simply use drag and drop. So I can click, left click that is, on the navy grid and drag it into the scene and then drop it onto the plane object and then release my mouse like so. And that's all I have to do. In fact, if I zoom in just a little bit on the plane and I look carefully at this material, you can see that there's a grid pattern assigned to it, but it's not very prominent. I want to make this a bit more prominent. So to do that, all I have to do is select this material, make sure that it's selected here in the project panel, so it's displayed here in the Object Inspector, and I can adjust its properties. Now for the emission setting here, I'm going to click on that color swatch, which is right now black. I'm going to click on that and a color picker will display. And this will allow me to choose the color of the grid lines displayed on this material. I'm just going to set the color to white, which is the top left of the dialog. You can see the color displayed here. So again, the color I'm using is displayed up here. It's also changing here in the object inspector. So I'm going to move over here to this color and just close the dialog here. And I'm just going to increase the brightness. And to do that, we can use this setting here. Just going to click and drag next to it. And as I do that, by looking at the material here in the viewport, you can see that the brightness of the grid lines has now intensified, and I can see those grid lines much better. So this is a good beginning for the floor object where I'm going to be using a grid pattern. Let's move on. Now next I want to make the floor perhaps just a little bit larger. Now to do this I could just come back in and change the scale. Maybe, for example, if I wanted to double it, I would just have to change the scale from 4 to 8. And indeed I could do that. But another way to do it, and the way I'm going to choose, is I'm going to make more objects of the floor and simply repeat them next to one another in a tile formation. So the way I can do this is just simply select this object here. Well, one other way I could do it, for example, is just go Game Object, Create 3D Object, and choose another quad, and put another quad into the scene. But if I did it that way, I would then have to rotate it, and then I'd have to drag and drop the material on it again, and it could get pretty tedious. So I'm going to delete that quad. Instead, what I can do is I can select this object and duplicate it by pressing Ctrl D on the keyboard or Command D on the Mac. I could also choose Edit and then choose Duplicate. So I'm going to press Ctrl D. When I do that, Unity creates a duplicate of the object. You can see that a new object has been added here, and it has appended the number 1 at the end of the object name. I'm going to just move this object out of the way, and here we have the duplicated version of the object. So I want to put this object next to this one. Now again, I could kind of get it about right there maybe, but of course it's still possible that I go too far and then these overlap. It's also possible that I go too far this way and there's a small gap between them. I want these two objects to align exactly to one another. It's also possible that I could be over this way too, in which case then I have to align exactly this way and then exactly that way, and it could take me all day doing that. Unity thankfully provides us with a feature called vertex snapping that allows us to precisely align objects very quickly. I'm going to expand the scene viewport here by pressing Shift Spacebar, and now I'm just going to get a better view of these. So to snap objects together, I have to make sure that I have the Translate tool active. So come over here to where it says the Translate tool, or I can press W on the keyboard. Now, with the Translate tool active, what I then have to do is hold down the V key on the keyboard. Now, with the V key held down, as I move my mouse around, you can see the gizmo here is snapping to different points on this object. In fact, it's snapping to the corner points. So what I want to do is to pick a corner point, this point here, that I want to align to this corner. So I'm going to choose this corner and I want it precisely aligned to this corner. So just by holding down the V key, moving my mouse to this corner, then clicking and dragging to this corner, the two objects will now snap together and precisely align. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to select this object, press Ctrl D to duplicate it, move it away from here. So here is the duplicate version. I'm going to make sure that the Translate tool is active here. Hold down the V key and click and drag this corner to this corner. And now these are aligned. I'm going to select this object, hold down the Shift key to select this object, and hold down the Shift key to select this one, and now I've selected all three together. I'm then going to press Ctrl D again to duplicate, and this time I've duplicated all three objects as well. I'm now going to hold down the V key to snap this corner to here, and notice all three together align this time. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to select this one, and this one by holding down the Shift key. Press Ctrl D to duplicate, move those duplicates away, hold down the V key and snap these in place, and now we have a nice square floor in place. I'm going to leave it there for the moment. That's probably a square floor done using duplication and vertex snapping. That's looking pretty good, but it's still time for us to move on. We haven't added anything to our scene like a user-controlled ball or anything like that, and that's what I'm going to focus on next. Now we've created a floor for the rollerball game, it's time for us to actually add the player control functionality to the game. Before I go ahead and do that though, there's just one issue that's been bothering me, and that's this. If I select the floor object in the hierarchy panel, it selects this single tile of the floor, and if I move it, it just moves that tile on its own. What I would like to happen is, for example, to select this floor object, and when I move it, to have all the elements of the floor move along with this in relation to it, maintaining its distance from it. So I want to be able to move this out of the way and all these other objects follow along with it. Well, we can use that. We can do that in Unity by using object hierarchies. And let me show you how that works. You can see here in the hierarchy panel that we have this floor object which represents simply this tile on its own. The other tiles of the floor, if I select them, for example, such as this corner one, you can see this is floor 7. And floor 8 happens to be this tile, floor 5 happens to be this one, 2, 3, and so on. Each of these tiles has a unique name and is selected separately. If I want all of these other tiles to follow along with this floor object, then I simply have to parent them to the floor. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to select the floor 1 tile, which is this one here in the corner. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and select the top tile. And when I do that, all the intervening tiles between have been selected too. So floor 1 to floor 8 have all been selected. I don't have to hold down the Shift key. I could also instead hold down the Control key, and then when I click on individual items, they are added to the selection individually. So there are two ways to go. You can select the bottom item and the top one by holding the Shift key, and it will select them all. Now with all those objects selected, I can drag and drop them underneath the floor object here in the hierarchy panel. And when I do that, all of these objects are now parented to the floor, and a twirly arrow icon appears next to the floor, and I can contract and expand the floor to display these objects. Now if I select the floor object, all the other objects will move with it. And in fact, if I do something like rotate that floor, all the others rotate in alignment with it too. So that represents the power of object hierarchies, and we're going to be revisiting this and seeing the power of hierarchies all throughout this course. So what I've done here basically is create a simple floor object that is parented to this floor here, and now we can move the whole floor all together as one piece. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z just to undo the movement there, leaving this hierarchy in place, and I'm going to fold up the floor just so that it tidies up this hierarchy panel. The next thing is I want to add player control to this object. So let's have a look in the standard assets folder under the characters group. And under the characters group we have a variety of different folders that we can use. If this were going to be a first person game, I could go into the first person folder here, and you'll see under the group prefabs, you'll see that we have FPS controller. So if I select FPS controller and I drag and I drop that into the scene, and I just move this up a little bit so that it's resting on the floor. Let me just zoom in just to take a look at that. Just going to move that down here on the floor. You can see now I've added a first-person controller asset to the scene. If I press play on the toolbar, I can now walk around the level in using first-person controls. Actually, let me just maximize the game tab, so shift space to maximize that. And now I can walk around this entire environment using first-person controls, and it really is that simple to make a first-person game. So really, in just no time at all, we've managed to get a first-person control system up and running. Of course, I could do something silly like just run off the edge and just fall into oblivion, and I'm just falling down into nothingness. We don't really want to do that. I'm just going to stop playback by pressing Ctrl P on the keyboard and pressing Shift Space to return back to our game. Now, we don't actually want this to be a first-person game. We actually want to control a rolling ball. So I'm going to select the FPS controller here in the hierarchy panel and press the delete key on the keyboard to delete that item from the scene entirely. I'm going to return back here to the characters folder in the project panel, and I'm going to go to the rollerball folder here instead. And in the prefabs folder, we have a rollerball object. So I'm going to click and drag the rollerball object into the scene and just raise it up here, like so, just resting on the floor like this. And right now the rollerball is looking pretty grey. Instead, I'm going to choose the materials folder for this rollerball. So if I go back to the rollerball folder, you'll see that we have materials and we have this material here for the rollerball. We could click on this rollerball material here, like so, drag and drop it onto the ball. So we have this rollerball material. And if I want to assign some color to this, well, I can do that. I can select this color slot here and just change the color. So I could make this, I don't know, maybe a greenish color. So something like this kind of green to it. I think that looks okay. So I'm going to close the color swatch, and now we have a ball in the scene. I'm going to press play on the toolbar, and you can see in the distance we have the ball resting on the ground. It's in the distance because the camera object that we have in the scene, if I just press stop a second, if I go back to the scene tab, you can see that the camera object we have in the scene is way out here in the scene. I could, of course, change its position. Let's just bring the camera object into the scene, raise it up here. You can see in this preview panel what the camera can see when it's selected. I'm just going to rotate the camera just like any other object, like so. And now you can see in the preview panel, we've got a much better view on that ball. I can jump over to the game tab and see the kind of view that we have. Something else that you can do too to align the camera is switch back to the scene tab. Is get a nice view on your object here in the scene tab. So maybe something like this. You can then select the main camera object in the scene and then choose game object and choose align with view, or press Ctrl-Shift-F. When you do that, it will align the camera with the scene view. If I now press play on the toolbar to play the game, and I use the W, A, S and D keys on the keyboard, you can see that the ball starts rolling around. It's already set up so that we can actually control the ball in the environment. And that's looking good. The only issue with this right now is that I want the camera to move and follow the ball as it rolls around the scene, and we'll be looking at how to do that next. So now it's time to make the camera follow the ball as it rolls around the level. Now, one thing it's reasonable to think here is if we think back to the scenario in which we have this floor object that we can select and move around, and other objects move with it, the other floor tiles, by using this parenting idea here. It is reasonable to think that perhaps we could have the camera follow the ball by making the ball a parent. So if, for example, we drag and we drop the camera underneath the ball object, and that way when I select the ball and I move the ball object, you can see that the camera also follows it in the scene and moves around with it. But if we press play on the toolbar to test the game in this configuration, we can see a problem. And the problem is simply this, that as the ball rotates around the level, as the ball moves and rolls, the camera rolls with it, and it should not do that. So that really is not the right way to approach this problem. I'm going to press stop on the toolbar here and just move the camera, drag and drop the camera back outside of the rollerball so it's no longer attached to the ball as it moves. Underneath here in the project panel in the standard assets folder, under the folder utility. And if you don't have this folder utility, you can import it into your project by choosing assets, import package, and choosing utility, but it should be imported automatically when importing the characters and the prototyping packages. So in the utility folder, if you scroll down, you will see a script file here called smooth follow, which allows a camera to follow an object. Now this is a script file. If I select it, you can see in the object inspector the code that is attached to that script. But right now what I can do is just drag and drop it on the camera object and release my mouse. When I select the camera object and I look at its properties in the object inspector, you can see that the smooth follow script has been added as a component and exposes these different properties that we can tweak to get the camera to follow the ball. So what we want to do is we want the camera to target the ball object. The ball object is going to be the target of the camera. So I'm going to drag and drop the rollerball object from the hierarchy panel into the target slot here and release my mouse. So now the target of the camera is the ball object in the scene. If I now press play on the toolbar and I move the ball, you can see the camera follows the ball quite nicely. I actually want the camera to be slightly closer to the ball and not quite so far away. So I'm going to press stop here and I'm just going to reduce the distance setting. I could type in a new distance, or I can click and drag on the distance parameter, the title here. I'm going to reduce it down to maybe about 4, something like that, and press play on the toolbar, and now the camera is much closer to the ball, and as the ball moves around, the camera will follow the ball nicely. So now we've got some controls up and running for the camera to follow the ball. Let's make the level perhaps a bit more interesting. So now let's add some improvements to our level. What I want to have is a ramp object that's going to be at the edges of the floor here so that the ball can roll down the ramp onto a different section of the level. Now to achieve that I'm going to need a ramp model for this scene, and thankfully the prototype assets that we have imported already come with a ramp object. If I double click on the standard assets folder and I go into the prototyping folder, under the models folder you will see a range of different models that we can use. Now I can also enlarge these preview pictures, these thumbnails, by clicking and dragging this slider down here in the project panel. So I'm going to click and drag that to the right to make the thumbnails a bit larger and scroll down, and here you will see ramp prototype. So I'm going to select this ramp object, and when I do select it, it appears in the object inspector here, and in the preview panel I can click and drag around that to see a preview of the model that I'm going to be using. I'm going to drag and drop this ramp into the scene like that, and you can see the ramp selected here. Now I want to align that with the floor here. So once again I'm going to use vertex snapping. Let's just maximize this view by pressing Shift Space on the keyboard. I'm going to switch to the translate tool with the W key, hold down the V key, snap this corner to this point here. I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate the ramp, snap that to there. Going to select both of these ramps, Ctrl D to snap these in place, Ctrl D again to snap these in place here, and now we have a ramp object leading down from this part of the floor. I'm going to press Shift Space to move out of this. I'm going to select the floor object here and press Ctrl D to duplicate that entirely. I'm going to hold down the V key to snap that floor to the bottom here, and now in no time at all we have created an environment in which the ball begins on an upper platform and can roll down to the lower. So let's give this a test. I'm going to switch to the game tab, maximize the viewport here, press play on the toolbar, and then give this a test. So the ball's rolling down this ramp to this other section of the level. Oh, but notice the ball just fell off the side. Well, let's try it again. So I'm going to press play, roll down the ramp to this area of the floor. Let's go back and see if we can go up the ramp. So I'm going to go this way, and oh, notice the ball did not go up the ramp. It actually went through the ramp. It actually passed through the ramp as though the ramp wasn't a solid object at all. Let's try that again, and the ball goes straight through the ramp. So let's see if we can solve this problem. The problem is because this ramp object, Unity is going to assume that this is completely ethereal and substanceless. It will allow any objects to pass through. It doesn't recognize it as a solid object. So we can easily fix this by moving down here and selecting the ramp model. So I'm going to click on that ramp model, and over here in the object inspector we have many different settings that we can change, but the critical setting, the one that we need to add, is this tick box here that says generate colliders. If we put a tick inside that box, Unity will recognize the mesh as a solid object. I'm going to scroll down to the button here that says apply to confirm those changes. We don't have to change the setting for each of these ramp meshes. All of these ramp meshes are referring to this ramp asset in the project panel. By making this a solid object, the changes are propagated to all the other ramps. Let's give it a quick try. I'm going to press play on the toolbar. Now I'm going to roll down the ramp. Now this time let's go back this way And aha, now we can come back up the ramp. So we can go down the ramp and come back up the ramp because we enabled a generate colliders option. So that's a great move forwards. Just one more thing now. I want to prevent the player from falling off the sides. We'll see how to do that next. Now I want to prevent the player from being able to take the ball off the edges of the level, falling into complete oblivion. In fact, we can do this using principles that we've seen already. So let's see how to do that. I'm going to create a completely new object in the scene. I'm going to choose Game Object, 3D Object, and Cube. So I'm going to create a cube object. Let's just move that off to the side. And I'm going to name this cube Barrier, like so. And I'm just going to move the cube as like a wall, basically. So I'm going to use the Scale tool, and I'm going to scale the cube further out this way, like so. And I'm going to scale the cube upwards as well. So let's make it a bit taller, maybe something like that. And then I'm just going to move it to the edge of the level. I could use vertex snapping here to precisely align it to the edge, but I'm not going to worry about doing that. So we've got one barrier here, and I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate this and move it to the other side to make another barrier. And Ctrl D again to create a third duplicate. I'm going to switch to the rotate tool and move it around to that side. I'm going to move that down to the end of the level there. And I'm going to press Ctrl D to move another invisible wall over here. Well, actually, it's not invisible yet. We've created 4 walls, but I don't want these walls to be visible to the player. I just want them to be basically invisible barriers. Well, we've seen how to do that already. By selecting the barrier object and removing the tick from the mesh renderer component, we can disable the rendering of this object. Notice we also have a box collider component, and this represents what Unity recognizes as a solid object. We want to keep that active because that will prevent the ball from passing through. But this renderer component is just responsible for making that box visible to the gamer. And I want to deactivate that for each of the barriers. So I'm going to take the mesh renderer out from this one. You can still see the green border outline, which is the box collider component. If I were to deactivate that, that would disappear as well. But I'm just going to reactivate it because I want collision to be active for this object. I'm going to select the other barriers and also remove, oops, I've just removed the box collider there. I actually want to remove the mesh renderer component. And I'm going to select the other one and remove the mesh renderer, and select this one too and remove the mesh renderer component. So now if I select this barrier, this barrier, this barrier, and this barrier, you can still see the barriers are there. It's only that the mesh is not visible. Now if I play the game and I start rolling the ball around, you'll see that the barrier takes effect and the ball cannot pass through the barrier. So now we have successfully managed to lock the ball within the play area and it can't roll off the edge. That is absolutely splendid. And this completes our basic ball game. We could, of course, add further cubes into here to provide more obstacles. And in fact, we could sort of go to the top viewport, choose Game Object here, bring in a cube, and we could bring in more cubes into the level. So I'm going to raise this cube up in the scene here. I could kind of pull that down to the floor, bring that out as a wall object, and again, duplicate this, bring this out as a wall, rotate it around maybe this way here. And in this way I could, if I wanted, build up a maze environment. Let's just duplicate these pieces downwards through here, like so. And if I were to press the play button on the toolbar, again, the object can't pass through those, and we could build up a whole maze environment. So this is looking very, very good. We've got the basics of Unity nailed down now. We can actually start to build up our own sample projects. There's still a lot more of Unity to see. It's a phenomenal application. But what we've seen here are the fundamental concepts for using Unity and for building a sample project. So this has been 3D Motive. Thank you for watching this first part. I hope to see you in the next part, where we'll consider terrain and other assets.